Okay, everyone, we're back on January 11th, day 11 of our Bible reading with Kathy Carter. So Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. That means that we are reading through the Bible every day for the next 365 days. We're actually already 10 days in, so this is day 11, and I am using the 1 Year Chronological Bible plan, which is at the 1 Year, which is sort of a brand name, the 1 Year Chronological Bible Online. And so if you wanted to pick up that reading form, it's just so we're all on the same page. So while we're reading, everything's on the same page, and it's a historical walk through the Bible instead of a walk book by book by book. So we go through it historically as it happened is the goal. And I think that's just going to make it easier to understand and definitely more interesting, I think. So I was able to connect a lot of dots that I was never able to connect before I did it chronologically. So today we are on day 11. And so that means we came from day 10, which yesterday we were talking about Jacob and how he had married both Leah and Rachel. And he had his first 11 sons. And so when we were left off, Rachel had just had Joseph and she was praying for another child. So here we're going to move on and we are in Genesis 30. So the reading today is Genesis 30:25 through Genesis 31. So those are sort of about a chapter and a half that we have reading today. So what we notice is Jacob is working for Laban, and he has multiplied, and Laban is his father-in-law, which is his mother's brother. So we find that connection. He's obviously the nephew, which means he's the cousin of his two wives, and so they have kept it in the family, which is exactly what Isaac wanted. So Isaac and Rebekah wanted him to marry inside the family of faith, so to speak. So inside the family of people who believe that God was the one true God. So uh, Jacob is working for Laban. And so what we've seen so far is he worked 7 years to get Rachel and he got Leah instead. And then he promised to work 7 more years if he was given Rachel. So he got Leah, then he got Rachel, worked 7 more years after that. And while he was working, he was caring for Laban's livestock. So his sheep, his goats, his lambs. And one of the things that I noticed in this is that sheep and lambs, I thought they were the same thing. But what I've noticed, or what I looked up and what I found out is that sheep were adult sheep and lambs were young sheep. So it was anything 12 months and under. And so there was actually a difference between them. So we had sheep, we had lambs, and we had goats. And Jacob was patiently taking care of all of those things. And while he was doing that, everything increased. So the numbers increased of his livestock. So he was abundantly blessed. And Laban does recognize that God is with Jacob, and this is why he's getting abundantly blessed. And so Jacob at this point decides that he wants to go back home. One of the promises that was made to him by God was is that he would go back to the land that he came from. And so he's ready. He has been there for at least 14 years. We find out a little bit later how much, but he's been there at least 14 years. And so he's ready to go back home. And of course, he says that he wants to bring his family back home. And Laban wants to continue to keep him. So Laban's essentially like, what can I offer you to get you to stay? And so they sort of have a little bit of a barter. And what they wind up coming down to is Jacob says, I want you to give me anything that is any of that livestock, because he's been taking care of the livestock. So any of the livestock that is spotted or speckled or dark. And so these things might not possibly be as coveted as your more clean looking livestock, that those things seem to be better and maybe worth more. And so he was agreeing to have to take the lesser. And then what we see Jacob doing is, so in verse 34, if we go down to 34, he says, agreed. Laban says, agreed. Let it be as you have said. And then that same day, he removes all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had any white on them, and all the dark colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. So even though he agreed to give Joseph these lambs, he does a kind of a sneaky deed, and he takes all of them and he hides them and gives them to his sons. And then he travels for 3 days. So these animals aren't even near where they would be taking care of the livestock. So he gives all of these. So then essentially Jacob's starting at nothing. And what I would make of this is that it just means that Laban wants to keep him longer. And so he recognizes that Jacob has given him a lot of stuff, and he wants to keep Jacob doing what he does best, which is caring for the livestock and getting more and more money for Laban. So Jacob seems to accept that. And then what we see is that Jacob finds a way around it. And so I'm sure there's a ton of issue around whatever it is he does, but they sort of over explain that he tears up bark, and he has some white exposed, and then he puts it in the water where the lambs would go, and then they would mate with the other lambs. And this created some spotted and speckled. And then the stronger ones, he would continue to mate those. So anything that was spotted and speckled, he would continue to mate the stronger spotted and speckled animals because he knew how to take care of them. I mean, he'd been doing it for 14 years, so it doesn't surprise me that he knows how. And he'd been abundantly blessed, so God had been with him in this as well. So he continues to grow, and then he builds, which I'm sure it takes years again. And so he continues to build up his household. So because his wages are all the spotted and speckles. And so we move on to Genesis 31. And in Genesis 31, at this point, God tells him to go home. So before it seemed like Jacob wanted to go home, and now it seems that God is ready and tells him to go home. So what he saw was that Laban's sons were starting to turn on him, and then Laban sort of wasn't behaving the way he had behaved before. And so he was starting to turn on him as well. And so God says in verse 3, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So God blesses him going back to his home and says that he will be with him when he goes back to his home. And then in verses 7 through 9, it says, starting out in 6, it says, you know that I've worked for your father. So he's talking to his wives. Jacob is talking to his wives, Leah and Rachel. And he says, you know, I've worked for your father with all of my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones would be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled ones. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. And so once again, we see the basics of that God has promised to be with Jacob, and therefore we see that he is with Jacob. But we also see when he was when Laban was doing things to be underhanded and to be sneaky and to try and take advantage of him, God protected Jacob. And he also punished Laban. So Laban's animals did not do well, and Jacob's animals did. So what we see is, it looks to me, what we see is it's both a providence of God, because God promises he will be there and protect. And so he sort of helps to create some of these speckled ones. And we also see the work of Jacob. Jacob continues to do work, and he continues to work his hardest and his best, because he says, I have worked with all of my strength. So he's using the gift that he's been given as well, as he's using the sovereignty and the promise of God to continue to bless him and to continue to honor him. So moving on to verse 15. So then they get ready. They do the wives agree. The wives say, you know, he hasn't really done anything for us as well. He sold us, and then after he sold us, then he also spent all of that money. So he hasn't really treated them well either. And so they agree to go with him. And then they say, verse 15, both of the women say, does he not regard us as foreigners? And this brings me back to when I was talking a couple of days ago about the way foreigners were treated. So they did not own the land, and therefore it was when I had noticed that Abraham and Isaac both were so fearful of the way that the local king would treat them that they were not honest about their wives actually being their wives, because their wives I assume were beautiful, and so they were afraid that the kings would take them, and so they weren't honest there. And so even the girls are saying he treats us as foreigners. So there's something at that time that foreigners were not treated the same as those who were of whatever area that was. So when you were in that area, you were born in that area, you were treated and behaved in one way, and then foreigners who came in did not have the same rights, did not probably have the same treatment as those natives that were already in that land. So there's already a distinction that they're different, because the girls are saying that their father treated them poorly, and then she's comparing them. They're comparing to that he's treating them like foreigners. And so I think that just gives us a better view of what it meant to be treated like a foreigner. So then they ran away at night, and because they ran away at night. So we see that they ran away at night, and they took everything they had with them. So Jacob took everything there. And in verse 25, one of the things that I just noticed in verse 25, this has already come up a lot. So they ran for 7 days. And then in verse 25, it says, Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You have deceived me. You have carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye." If that was what he really wanted to do, I don't think he would have been so angry when he caught up with them. I think he would have just said, "I've come to kiss my grandchildren goodbye. I'm so sad. I missed you." But instead, he says, "You've done a foolish thing." Verse 29, "I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" So the only thing that kept him from saying anything was God coming to him in a dream the night before. And then he says right after this, "Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's household, but why did you steal my gods?" And the reason I bring this up is because Rachel stole the gods. So they were idols, uh, probably some kind of household idols that she stole, like some household like representations of God. Laban knows who God is, the one true God, because God spoke to him the night before. So Laban knows who he is. He knows he exists. He knows there is a real God. And yet he also worships these idols. And he says, "What about my other gods?" And so putting this question sort of out in the universe about what that means. Are there smaller gods that people worshiped to their detriment? So was there something else on the earth that was different? So we have this vision earlier, a couple of days earlier, where he says, "I will be your God," where God says that to the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, "I will be your God, and I will look over you until you don't need me anymore." And or until he finishes the promise, which is eventually bringing Jacob back into his land. And so I just wonder if there is something smaller that maybe is not meant to be worshipped, or we go to that smaller God and worship that without recognizing that God is the one true God. And so we set our hopes upon this other God, thinking that this is the full God, instead of recognizing that the one true God, the God that made everything, because in this, God has told us that he is the one who created the universe. He is the one who created the world in 7 days. He created the stars. He created the sun. He created the moon. So this is the God of creation who did all things. And so why would we spend time worshiping anything that wasn't him? Why would we waste our energy on a small idol when the real God, the true God, the God that made everything is right there sort of for the taking? And maybe then he wasn't there for the taking. Maybe then, because I would think that Laban would want to just worship that God and that God alone, because he knows who he is. And he knows he came to him, and he knows he blessed Jacob. And so it would seem like that would be the God that he would want to worship. But maybe it wasn't that time for that until we find out later when Jesus comes and he opens the door to everyone. So just sort of a question to put out there, and to try and understand what that might look like. And in recognition that I get to worship the one true God. So because of Jesus, that door has been opened for me, whereas before it wouldn't have necessarily been open to me. So, and then we're going to move on, and moving on to verse 32 through 35. And so in 32 through 35, it says, so here's another way that I can just see that God is being protective and God is protecting Rachel because uh, Jacob makes this very clear. So Laban's going to go look for his little idols. And Jacob makes a very clear statement that says, Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and the tent of the two female servants, but he found nothing. After he came out, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent and found nothing. And it feels as if this is a protection from God because Jacob says, if you find anyone who has your gods, that in verse 32, if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it. And so, Rachel, it would have been devastating to uh, Jacob to have lost Rachel. And so, again, I just look back and I don't want to say it always works out well for us because that's certainly not the case. We all have uh, hardships and we all have trials and tribulations and things that are hard for us and people that we love that we lose. But it does seem in this situation that so God has protected her. And I think really what he did is he protected Jacob because Jacob didn't even know that those idols had been stolen. So he may not even be protecting Rachel, but he may have been protecting Jacob and the covenant that was with Jacob and just protecting him from that hardship of losing Rachel. Now, if we move down to verse 42, it looks like Laban gets yelled at. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. So again, he's reminding us that God is with him. And then in verse 45, Laban decides, or before that, Laban decides he wants to make a deal. And in that deal, he wants to go off sort of safely with both of them. So they make a line, and he says, "You won't go any farther than this, and I won't go any farther than that." And they kind of agree not to cross paths anymore. And so what I just wanted to see was that he set up in verse 45. Once again, he sets up a pillar. So it seems that Jacob has established this stone as pillar with oil situation. And then in verse 45, again, it says, so Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And then he said to his relatives, gather some stones. They put them in the heap and they ate by the heap. And so they just said it was a witness between you and me today. And so then they have this covenant with each other. On that note, we are done this chapter. We are all the way up to 43. Sorry, we are all the way up to 31. We're at the end of 31. And so tomorrow we will be starting in Genesis 32, and that will be day 12. If you guys like this, I want you to share, subscribe, like it, and then I will be back tomorrow. Thanks.